So, as I alluded earlier, the purpose of this session is to start to broaden the conversation around sustainability of a center-like activity, um, like SpectrumX. Um, I'm going to provide a little bit of context and kind of frame this session. And, Scott Palo and I have been kind of prepping this session together. So, Scott's going to jump in case I miss some key points along the way. So, thank you, Scott. Emily, if you go to the next slide for us, please. So here's how we're thinking about spending the next hour and 15 minutes or so. Again, we want to broaden the conversation about sustainability of SpectrumX or a center like SpectrumX. So for context, sustainability here, what we're referring to is sustaining at least some of the activities that we've initiated through SpectrumX, keeping them, strengthening them, but really creating a permanent hub, academic hub in this radio spectrum ecosystem. Okay. Uh, for some more context, this is a topic that we have been discussing within the leadership team of SpectrumX. It's been discussed at our NSF panel reviews. We have an annual review panel. And so starting a year and a half ago, actually, this issue of sustainability of SpectrumX, what does that look like? How do we actually sustain it, and so on, has been an ongoing conversation. We wanted to use this session at the center meeting to kind of get more folks involved in the ideation and the feedback about this topic. So the way we're going to do that is Scott and I have prepared some additional context. We're going to kind of review where SpectrumX is situated within NSF's broader investments in spectrum research. And also then maybe provide a little bit of context on the closest thing to large-scale centers like SpectrumX, which are called ERCs, Engineering Research Centers in NSF's world. Then we'll summarize some questions that we'd like to address, pretty high-level questions. And then we're going to break out into a number of breakout rooms in the Zoom tool here. Each breakout will have a note taker, and then we'll have some report outs at the end before we transition. And then, of course, using this information, we'll incorporate it into the thinking and the planning that we're doing for the remainder of the initial SpectrumX grant, but also look ahead to other more sustained funding opportunities, future proposals, and the like. So that's the plan. And I saw there was a question about sustainability. The question we want to answer is, what is sustain? What do we sustain? But we think that having some kind of permanent hub, academic hub, will make some sense. It's just a question of what is that hub going to do as we go forward. All right, if you could go to the next slide, please. So again, for context, SpectrumX is situated in a series of programs, within a series of programs at NSF. So many of you know that NSF has had a series of what they call cross-directorate programs focusing on spectrum research specifically. It was EARS, SPECIES, SWIFT, and now the latest version of that is New Spectrum. This is really fundamental, basic research in spectrum science. They tend to be, medium-sized awards at most, 3 PIs or so. And that has been happening. I think the first program of that sort was around the 2010 timeframe when EARS started. More recent, and I want to acknowledge John Chapin's input on this slide to make sure that we characterize things properly. One of the ways he described it is that these cross-directorate programs kind of have been created bottom up, where different directorates have seen value in collaborating and putting these programs together. And that's why over time they kind of get reinvented and reformulated and renamed. The other more recent development has been the Spectrum Innovation Initiative, or the SII. And this John described as more top-down. So certain things that weren't happening, that weren't being accommodated effectively by the cross-directorate programs, were then incorporated into the planning of the SII. So one of them, of course, is the SII Center, which became SpectrumX. But another important program under the SII is this National Radio Dynamic Zone, or NERDS program, that we've heard a lot about. This is a program that's specifically advancing the use of dynamic spectrum sharing in and around a number of NSF facilities and related type places. We also want to keep in mind that for many years, NSF has invested in these test beds, the so-called platforms for advanced wireless research, or POWER. These have been placed at the University of Utah. There was one at Columbia that we heard mentioned, the Cosmos test bed earlier today. There's one at North Carolina State University, and there's one at Iowa State University. And these are meant to be, pretty large scale, well beyond the size of a lab, real world settings, remotely accessible, programmable test beds for advanced wireless research. The other thing to stress here is that in recent years, all of these programs have really enjoyed more input, more collaboration with the spectrum regulators, the NTIA and the FCC in the United States, through this memorandum of agreement that was created with NSF. And so this is the mix of things that are going on. SpectrumX is one point in this constellation. And so it's in that context that we want to think about sustaining and having a conversation about sustainment. If you could go to the next slide, please, Emily. So SpectrumX is not an engineering research center, or ERC, but in terms of the size of the investment, in terms of the duration of the investment, at least the initial award, these are 5-year awards. They tend to be $25 million a year awards, like SpectrumX was. The other thing is that ERC programs have been running for a long time, and so there's some useful insights to potentially obtain from this program at NSF. These are run in a number of different fields. This is a cross-directorate program as well. And so over time, the directors of engineering research centers have developed something called the Best Practices Manual. And there's a link to that manual here. When you study that manual, they talk a lot about a diversity of funding sources for ERCs, industry fees for partners to be contributing varying amounts, depending upon what they get for those contributions. Supplemental funding from federal programs as well as from NSF itself. And then over time, even considering things like endowment level support, either from corporate or private donors. They've also characterized the different stages of development of these engineering research centers. And so many of them, if they are successful centers, and I think, we want to see successful centers in general, they get an initial 5-year award, and then they're often renewed for another 5 years from NSF. And so they break it down over this 10-year time frame, where they talk about new centers, the first 3 years, kind of building up the capacity, doing strategic planning, attracting new members, and developing forums for interaction. So-called midterm centers, that what they refer to as years 4 to 7. The keys are demonstrating successful industrial collaboration and technology transfer. Let me emphasize that word here. Promising to be more to come beyond the 6-year review and beginning to prepare for self-sufficiency. So if you like, this is, at least in terms of the ERC timeline, this is where we find ourselves as SpectrumX. We're halfway into our year 4 of our initial, what we hope is an initial 5-year award. And so this is kind of the point where we should be starting to think about sustainability and self-sufficiency, as it's referred to here. There's some other details here about how these centers continue to evolve going forward. But the key bullet, which I didn't actually get a chance to bold, is we should be starting to think about long-term sustainability, planning with partners, in year 4. So we're kind of on track to be starting to have this more serious forward-looking conversation. So that's the Best Practices Manual, which is developed by an association of the center directors for ERCs themselves. There are also a fair number of reports that NSF compiles for the program as a whole. So if we grab the ERC report from 2020 and we go in and we kind of look at what these centers look like, there's 2 key statistics here that we grabbed to just kind of highlight. So there's a number of organizations that get involved in centers. On average, about 35 organizations are involved per center in the ERC program. And for reference, where we're at with SpectrumX, we can count about 25 collaborating organizations at this point. Those collaborations are taking different forms. Did I say 25? I should have said 20. I meant 20. Um, they're taking different forms, but this is an area where, with Song's help and a lot of input from our external advisory board, we're continuing to grow relationships and attract companies and federal agencies to get involved with SpectrumX. The other statistic that they cite is external funding that is provided to the center, not from NSF proper. And so an average of 450K per year per center is what we see. And again, those statistics are for centers across their 10-year time horizons. So the smaller centers have fewer partners and perhaps are getting less money. The larger centers have many more partners and presumably are getting a lot more money. And so given where we're at, we're kind of a midterm center, if you like. And so we thought these average numbers are good benchmarks for us to compare ourselves to. Okay, so this is kind of some of the framing that we'd like to create for this conversation. If you go to the next slide, Emily. Again, what we're going to do is break out. Roughly, we've got 30, 35 minutes or so that we can have these discussions. We have about 27 folks participating here. Sorry, now we have 26. But we want to have some small group discussions. Given that backdrop, we want to start to develop answers to these questions. Hopefully, many of you have been involved in the center meeting. You have a sense of everything that SpectrumX has going on. One of the main questions is, given what we're doing, what should we aim to sustain? That's the first question. Second question is, are there other opportunities? We heard some discussion of that in the, some of these directions in the academic panel in particular, but also the government and industry panels. What are the challenges that are out there as we continue to go forward? Which directions might we want to incorporate or pivot to as part of SpectrumX? So in other words, what to add? And then some creative thinking about how to support it, right? Given the model of ERCs with industry funding, whether it's memberships or sponsored research projects, supplemental or creating proposal teams that chase after other standing funding programs, but that bring resources to the SpectrumX to support the scope of SpectrumX. How do we support all of these activities beyond this initial award? And just for a data point, our initial award with NSF is due to end in fall of 2026. Roughly late August, mid-September timeframe. So those are the three key questions. And Emily, I think what I might do is ask you to copy those into the chat. So hopefully everybody has access to them and they're kind of planted in their minds. What we'll do is we'll break out into roughly 5, and we have about 5 people per group. 5 breakout rooms here that's pseudo-randomly created. We'll ask each group to designate a facilitator and or note taker. It could be the same person, but to collect everyone's comments and thoughts about these 3 questions. And then after 30 minutes or so, we'll get back together and we'll have some quick report outs. We'll add those reports to the minutes, and then we'll transition into the closing of the center meeting. Okay, we're back. Thanks, Emily. I guess it worked. So what we'll do now is we'll have some report outs from each of the breakouts. And so whoever was the note taker or the representative of each breakout that wants to share the thoughts that were collected, feel free, if you want to take photos of your handwritten notes and email them to Emily. Maybe she can drop her email in the chat. I've asked her to frantically take notes as we chat here, but we'll just go around and we'll go one breakout session at a time and have people share their answers to these sustainability questions. Anybody want to go first?
I can
I
go ahead.
okay.
Go ahead, Nick. So
Yeah, Renee asked if we can ditch the slide at this point so we can be more biased towards seeing people and take me off. There we go. There's the group.
right. So we we had five of us in the room, and so I had some broad discussion. Not everybody had time to participate in all elements of SpectrumX meeting, and some were new to the SpectrumX, so we did spend a little bit of time sort of level setting and going and talking about what we are doing. I mean, I think that it's challenging. I think was the what came out. I mean, as we were talking about it, it's like, well, the research is important, right? That's we're doing things in a way that's difficult to do with small research teams, to have more complex, organized research projects. Of course, training the next gen is important, and building those tools and bringing those folks along. The policy is unique and something that doesn't typically happen with sort of a cross-cutting team. It tends to be more siloed. We did have discussion, probably a significant discussion about industry relationships, and how we might think about those, how we bolster them, some of the challenges there. Chris Simmons, had experience, was bringing some of his perspective. One of the challenges looking from an industry perspective is, what's the value proposition? New small companies tend to want to have all the IP themselves, so they tend not want to be and don't have the resources. Larger companies may have resources, but you have to articulate the value proposition for engaging. I think Dennis had mentioned the sort of the multiplicative factor of the investment multiplied by the federal dollars, and that seemed to resonate, to see there's an immediate return on investment, at least in terms of being able to scale up the investment in specific areas. So that came through as a positive. And so we also talked a little bit about what are the sustainability options. I said mentioned there's the industry model, for sustainability at some level. There's support from the federal government. We can figure out how to productize something, but in some sense there we're turning into a company. The typical university of sort of translating research to get revenue, which hasn't historically been terribly successful. And then Dennis also brought up the potential of finding a foundation, finding in some sense, an angel, somebody that's passionate about the work and wants to support it and see it continue, and build a relationship there. So those are kind of the high level thoughts. I don't know that we solved any of the problems, but we had a good discussion, and it sort of seeded some of the thoughts.
Thanks, Scott. And thanks to your group. Who else was in your breakout, just so we know?
Uh, so is Dennis, Roberson, Julie Hahn, Chris Simmons, and then we had Willem, whose last name I forgot. I have to go look for it here.
Landis, maybe?
Landis, Willem Landis. Yes, that was our,
Great.
that was our group.
Well, thank you all for putting those thoughts together and for sharing them, Scott.
Can I go
Who
next?
wants to go next?
Can I?
Federico.
Yes. Thank you. Okay. I was in a group with Scott Baker, Song Shan, Ilya Mursavishvili, and Mike Honig, and myself. So basically, can you hear me well?
Yes, you're coming
Okay.
through loud and clear.
Okay. So basically, we had a very intense and fruitful discussion. The first thing we started discussing came out. I will not mention people, but it was the overall discussion, basically that there may be a need in the center to have a more spirited conversation about the vision that we want to share for the next 10, 20 years. And again, that sometimes there are different backgrounds that we come from, and it is difficult to harmonize. And probably that we should be asking more to the stakeholders, for example, NTIA, what is their view of the center and how they want them to interact with us or us with them. And sometimes it's not really clear what the stakeholders get from the center. And then another person said that the way they see the center impacting the world is primarily through policy making. And this was a very interesting point that then the discussion revolved around because the point then went back to stakeholders or companies that perhaps could perceive and see the center as a way to influence policy making. And someone else mentioned that exactly there are companies, probably I guess Verizon, that didn't see any that saw that there were some contrasting views within the center, and that was probably one of the reasons why they were not super into collaboration with us. And then, yeah, basically that we need to understand what they need. And at some point I was also saying, okay, probably what the center could become is a platform, a floor in which academics, policymakers, companies meet together, discuss, and try to find new solution. And then, of course, for example, Song again said, yeah, but we are academics, right? And our goal is primarily educating people and doing technical research. So the point is, then at the point Mike said that the way he says about he sees about the center is two main paths. First, to broaden the technical solution to address incentive problems, and then distributed market solution, meaning how to build new tools, not only in terms of economic tools and markets, but also in terms of technical tools in order to have distributed markets, decentralized markets. And again, for example, then Ilya said that a lot of times technical solutions, engineering solution provides new insights of policymaking rules that can be sustained and achieved. And then we start talking, okay, but how can we make it appealing for not only policymakers, but also for companies to come to us? And there was a discussion about the way we can model and visualize opportunity costs through interaction with engineers at the center and students at the center, etc., etc. More or less, this is the discussion we had. Hope it was a bit clear and not too fast.
Thank you, Federico. Next group.
I can go next. We had
Randy.
a small group. It was myself, Randy Herman, so it was the group of Randys, and then we had Nikos was there as well, so just the three of us. And I think we covered a lot of similar points, so I won't repeat. But in terms of the first question about what to sustain, I think it's I guess somewhat obvious that answering that depends a lot on how much money you have. Right. I think if it's a much reduced, then the question of what to sustain is a much harder question to answer. Clearly we'd like to sustain our research efforts. We also highlighted things like a REU program has been great. And just the community building that SpectrumX has done and being a sort of community builder for the Spectrum community is something that we would hope to see sustained in this. A couple of other, comments about, what to add. one thing Nico's pointed out is in terms of the current funding, research funding models in the center, we have sort of seed projects that are relatively small scale, and then we have large flagships. We don't have much in between for sort of taking, like, say, a seed idea that's promising and pushing it further. It'd be nice to see the ability to do that, but of course that would require more funding. We talked about some areas. So one area we've talked about that's, I know within the center we've also discussed is cybersecurity as something that, do we need to have more of that, or is that sort of a separate concern that isn't necessary? And so that was talked a little bit about. We also talked about corporate funding. And I think with Spectrum, the challenge is that there's lots of different verticals that are of interest. And so a question is, do we continue to cast a wide net, or do we have to become more focused in certain verticals? The satellite one was one that we sort of highlighted as something that's really promising, that we do have some expertise in the center on, especially the LEO satellites. In terms of supports, also talked about government, the engagements with NTIA were highlighted as a way of maybe building on those types of things. DoD was also discussed as another partner. We have one effort in that direction, but there was a feeling that there could be more engagement with DoD around Spectrum. And then we also did, I think Scott mentioned this too, is thinking about I don't know if commercialization is the right word, but out of these flagship efforts, if we are building up an infrastructure, are there ways to monetize that infrastructure? Whether it's letting other people that are interested use it to take measurements at certain places, is there a structure there that could help support the center? That's all I'll say.
Sounds like some great input for such a small group. Thank you. All right. Let's see. We've hit 3 groups, right? So we should have 2 more.
Yeah, Nick, I've got one of them. I can do mine.
Thanks, Frank.
We had Eileen was with us, Renee, Raphael, and then Daniel Sheen and myself. We talked quite a bit about, I've got notes that I've shared with Emily, so she's got the whole thing in the summary. There was a lot of talk about the relationships, and the people are the core of SpectrumX. They're the core of what has been achieved, and they're really the important thing in the bigger picture. I mean, right? So we can have different levels of resources. We could have many, in a great ideal world, we could have other organizations in the federal government decide that this is really valuable and say, NSF, we really want to sustain this and make this bigger, and how can we grow it? And we have a little bit of an answer for that potentially, but at the end of the day, it's the people, it's our ability to work together to solve problems, and it's the willingness of people to engage in this that's important. We had quite a bit of discussion about incentivization for that. There's certainly a feeling, I think, that it's been hard to get people enough resources to keep them engaged. We've talked a little bit about the difficulty of funding technology projects. I mean, with the flagships, we've kind of ended up with some of those. But in the bigger picture, when you kind of look at what could be done for Spectrum, or what could be done, in terms of Spectrum research, it's almost a drop in the bucket in the bigger picture. And NSF's, it's a credit that NSF's managed to go get this much money for this area, and hopefully we'll be successful in following up to that. But when you look at it, what we came up with as an analogy was that engineering research centers are maybe not the right analogy for this. We're not going 5 years making a prototype and kind of reapplying. It's kind of not even maybe the science center analogy, but really more that what Spectrum may need is a federally funded research and development center. And when you step back and look at it, that starts to have the scope of money and sustained investment that looks like what you might want for Spectrum. Honestly, it's like JPL is NASA's FFRDC, Lincoln Laboratory is the Air Force FFRDC. Well, what about NTIA FCC? Clearly NSF's got a role in that with workforce development and basic research aspects. but you start looking at the levels of investment in those centers, and it starts to look like what you'd really need to robustly support and have the kind of ecosystem I think that we've built the pieces for with SpectrumX. And so underneath it, that's one part. Another big conversation we had was about maintaining the relationships with the federal agencies as the turmoil that's ongoing in Washington, it exhausts itself, hopefully. And that's a challenging thing, given that even some of the people we were talking to, say at NOAA, are no longer there or are in different positions. And we're going to have to really work hard in the near term, and near term may even, maybe the next 3 or 4 years for all we know, to try to, sustain those relationships, which are the ability of SpectrumX to work across industry and the federal government and academia with the organization that's put together is really unique. That's something that did not exist before, and is now academics can be a part of some of these conversations. We know people in the various agencies that are relevant, and they know about us. So I think that the human aspect of this is the really critical thing. Now, what to add. Obviously, if we could find a way to add money, that's great. I think that one of the things, I
So
certainly
much
think,
money.
and I put in our notes, whether it was just me or whether it was everyone agreeing, was that I don't think there's any substitute for near-term robust federal support. I think that things like this, to sustain them, probably take a larger scale size than we're at currently, which maybe means that the center has to grow beyond NSF within the federal ecosystem. I do think that industry, could be, incentivized to be more strongly involved. We had a discussion where, Eileen pointed out that she felt that a lot of the industry incentives that you would need to get them deeply involved just kind of aren't there with the center. And you may need to follow up with her for more details on that. But I think there's an aspect also of, well, if you made it in an industry center, well, then it starts to look like industry, and it starts to lose some of that objectivity that allows us to work across the agencies, and is really not the traditional, the industry likes to develop products and sell them and make, markets grow so that everybody if they work together, it's so they can grow the market somehow or destroy competitors. It's not necessarily going to be something that is cross-cutting and objective and is trying to achieve a societal benefit in a larger sense. That's, at some level, an outgrowth of achieving things for the shareholders. So there are different incentives in this that we really have to be cognizant of. And I think that's something that came across in our discussion, that it's very challenging for us to deal with that. And looking for growth outside the center, you have to be balancing that relative to what the center is able to do right now and is structured for. So that I think that's what came out of the notes. You'll see there's a bunch of commentary in it, but nevertheless, that was the discussion at some level. And I've biased it strongly with my own views, I'm sure. So apologies to anyone who is present. Speak up now if you have other perspectives, Renee or Daniel or Raphael. I think Eileen had to drop off, so she has no defense.
I think you covered it pretty well, Frank.
Oh, no, there you
Thanks.
go. I see. Okay.
Yes, and just to clarify, I think, this is a great summary of the discussion, but what I was pointing out to was what Frank said, which is industry would be involved in centers mainly to get something out of it that would be monetized in the near term, right? So if we become, in sustaining our center, if we become an industry center, then it'll just be a bunch of projects that are funded by individual industry working with individual members. And we felt that this sort of this community aspect of SpectrumX is sustainable by large investments going forward. So I don't know personally at this point how to sustain a center of this scale by industry funding alone. So that's what I was trying to point to with that comment.
Thank you all. And we have one more group.
Nick, do you want me to say something, or do you want to take it yourself?
No, please go ahead.
So, we were in a group together, Nick, myself, Gil, and AJ. And rather than repeating some of the things that have already been mentioned. And Frank, I stole from you about the people. I said that people are the most important thing that we need to sustain. AJ had some good comments about the haystack workshop, where it allowed creating connections with people, unlike perhaps a large conference. SpectrumX can get us some opportunities to get people in a room together, and these are the things that need to be sustained. In terms of what to add, we talked about long-term visions for Spectrum rather than looking at operating within the current regimes of Spectrum. And there were some interesting thoughts about how, for example, data from communication uses of Spectrum can be applied to scientific uses of Spectrum. And this is probably pivoting to integrated sensing and communications kind of applications. We also discussed about how certain needs that are being met by Spectrum today could be shifted to other alternatives, perhaps freeing up Spectrum. These may be things that we want to consider as part of SpectrumX. And the last thing I think, which was very interesting, which was mentioned by both Gil and AJ, was there are many, many different kinds of data that are being collected with Spectrum, and they're not harmonized. They could be probably reused. They could be there could be lots of benefits from these repositories of data that we are not addressing today. So those were some of the things that we discussed in terms of what we need to add and how to support these activities. Well, I'll take the blame for it. I said maybe we should tax every NSF grant which is related to Spectrum, but that was maybe they come and participate in SpectrumX.
You mean offer a subscription? Sorry.
So that is a quick summary of what we discussed.
I apologize. All of a sudden had an allergy fit. Well, thank you all for that input. Looks like Scott has his hand up here. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I just had a quick go back. There was a couple other things that I had neglected to mention. We definitely, had some discussion about emerging trends and, AI ML, and well, it's a buzzword and everybody puts it everywhere. It is, it is going to be impactful, and continuing to think about that. And then, the other trends coming, we had a short discussion about quantum and, how that might impact Spectrum. I think there's a broader question about how far down the road quantum is. Is that how emergent is that? But putting Spectrum sort of into that meta context as well, in terms of when you think about what to add or maybe directions to be considering.
Thanks, Scott. We have like another minute or so, a couple more minutes if we like, if there's any other broader commentary that we want to capture. Again, what to sustain, what to add, or how to pivot, and how to sustain.
So I can add something to just we talked about that Prashant reminded me of that I didn't have in my notes, was around the data side of it. And that's, as he said, there's been different activities on collecting different data sets. I think one of the things that's, happening in the flagship, and hopefully, would be nice to see sustained, is efforts to make accessing data easy and friendly. Right. And there's a lot of things out there, a lot of tools out there where that's not the case. Where it can be quite painful to navigate, or you have to ask somebody to get it, right? And I think having data that's, easy to get at and easy for, say, an undergrad to even use would be huge.
Any other comments before we wrap? Okay. Well, like I said, we wanted to broaden this conversation, get more input that we'll carry back to the leadership team. We'll continue to evolve how we think about this. Um, and then we'll be continuing to engage with the various stakeholders to see what parts they're interested in sustaining as we go forward.